So, Dr. Olson, if I may start with a question here to you.
Yes.
What has been the reaction from the intelligent design and the evolutionary science communities to this film?
Well, let's see. There was a lot of reaction 10 years ago when we made it. And it's kind of, it had its run for 2 or 3 years there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I think part of what happened was the intelligent design movement kind of had its spine snapped in the with that Dover trial that we mentioned in the movie there, and it kind of never really came back from that. So I think the movie was one of several things that helped kind of bring it down. And it's the film kind of has gone on to have more of a life as an exercise in science communication. And, it still gets screened in classes and things like that a lot. And so it's kind of been useful for 2 different things. The issue of attacks on evolution, and then also communication and how to communicate science effectively.
Thank you, Dr. Olson.
Yes.
Dr. Orzack, so this issue kind of went away after the demise of the Bush era, but how do you think about this now in terms of the current political climate, and especially the recent with the science education and divorce and so on and so forth?
I would add a very quick coda to what Randy said. It may be a good thing, but I think as much as the intelligent design advocates did not like the film, a lot of evolutionary biologists didn't like the film as well, not because they disagreed with the science, of course they agree with that, but they realized or were portrayed as being rather arrogant and not very friendly to ordinary folks. But to answer your question, I was impressed. I haven't seen this film for 5 years, about how prescient it is in terms of foreshadowing the most recent traumatic current events we've had in the last few months, the election of President Trump and the divisiveness that's surrounding that.
Stephen, it looks like Randy's having a hard time hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, no, I can hear fine now. Yeah.
Okay.
With the earphones in.
Intelligent design has not gone away. It was, as Randy was saying, very much set back on its heels by what happened in Dover, Pennsylvania, and a few other places. But it has still been, it's been something that the proponents have been waiting to push in various arenas, and they certainly feel empowered by what's happened politically in the last few months. And the latest development just started last week, and it's surrounding the standards for the Texas state high school textbooks. Texas is the largest textbook market in the country, so it dominates a lot of the curriculum development across the country, but at least in the narrow sense of the word, there's a lot of to and fro there. And just last week, the Texas State Board of Education, I brought some copies of their new standards if people want to look at them, included language that is very consistent in maybe a little less cryptic, a little more cryptic way than 10 years ago, but nonetheless is very consistent with the idea that you teach the controversy. So it's very much there as part of the sort of culture war between, at least in the short version of the telling of it, between the red state folks and the blue state folks. It's more complicated than that, but intelligent design, the ideas behind it are very much alive and well, and probably growing.
Thank you, Dr. Orzack.
Yes.
But before we turn the questions over to the audience, one last question to Dr. Olson. What impact do you think the film has had?
Let's see. It's kind of hard to gauge, but as I said, it had a good impact for a couple of years there in 2006 and 2007, and it's kind of trailed off and it gets shown in class and things like that. But it was on Showtime for a couple of years in 2007 and 2008, And I got probably 200 or 300 emails over those couple of years from different people. It was interesting because there wasn't an email address listed with the film. So these were, there were a lot of religious people around the country that were motivated enough to watch the film and search my name and find an email address for me at USC and send me emails. So it was kind of fun and interesting in that regard. But, you know, the question is whether these folks will come up with a new way to attack evolution, because that's what intelligent design was. It kind of came up out of nowhere, a whole new strategy that they developed, and it just makes you wonder if they're scheming on something else.
Thank you, Dr. Olson. We'd like to turn over the questions to the audience. If you would like to raise your hand and let us know if you have a question. Yes, sir.
Hi. Yeah, I was very impressed by how you talked about the ways in which these intelligent design proponents and or mostly Christians, I guess, were promoting themselves through PR firms and having lots of money. Even though the science community doesn't have as much money in terms of national associations for advancement of science and things like that in terms of PR, isn't that something that scientists and science people should be trying to do in the same way, simplify their messages and tell those narratives that you promoted? And it's been 10 years. Has that happened at all?
Yeah, that's a real good question. And in a lot of ways, it has happened in a really big way. Almost maybe too much of a way. It's questionable. Don't know if you've heard about what's coming together now. They're organizing a scientist march in April to correspond with Earth Day. And the crazy thing with that is there's a lot of debate right now on whether or not it's even a good idea. So no sooner did they announce it than there was an article in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago. Scientist, everybody's kind of wondering if he managed to get this whole editorial in there, but he just kind of pooped at the whole thing, said it's the last thing we need is a bunch of scientists marching. People are going back and forth on that. If you're really interested in this topic, I'm working on a blog post probably for sometime in the next days, but I'm resurrecting a tremendous speech given by Michael Crichton in 1989 to AAAS. He gave a keynote address there, and it was on this very topic. And the third sentence of his whole address, he said, it is the science world that doesn't understand the media. And that's the challenge, is we're a media-driven society, and it's pretty tough to really understand how crazy the media world is. I've been out here in LA for over 20 years now, kind of in the thick of it. And we now have a president who has a very deep intuition for how media and media manipulation works. And unfortunately, the left was kind of clueless in this last election. So I'm kind of involved with talking to people on this scientist march thing right now and kind of warning them to be careful. It can blow up in your face and blow back at you, and it's happened over and over for scientists. They've tried to do things in the media and not had enough savvy to really understand. I mean, just one little case in point to illustrate what I'm talking about. 2010, group of scientists were going to buy a full-page ad in the New York Times protesting the attacks on climate science. There were over 200 of them that had signed the petition, major scientists, and they had $50,000 they faced to do this thing. They got talked out of it. So instead, they did the petition Science magazine. And the editors of Science ran a photo that went with it of a polar bear standing on an ice floe. Only it turned out that they had photoshopped the photo of a polar bear and an ice floe from iStock. And no sooner did the article come out than the climate skeptics jumped all over it and said, here, look at these stupid scientists, you know, using a fake photo to make their case about the need to respect science. So you got to be aggressive and savvy, and media it's a very volatile and manipulative thing, and it's not the same as science. It's narrative dynamics, which is what I'm in the thick of teaching now. So yeah, it's my advice to the whole science world, and the book that I published 2 years ago, Houston, We Have a Narrative, Why Science Needs Story, is that everyone should be learning about narrative, and not storytelling, but about narrative. If you read the book, you'll really see how I distinguish the two. But narrative is at the core of everything, especially the scientific method, and that's the most important thing to be getting a grasp on.
I would add a couple things. Scientists, since 2005, the science establishment has come forward or evolved, to use a loaded word, tremendously in terms of its media savvy. A lot of that outreach, I mean, if you publish an article that has any kind of potential interest.
Sorry, I think we're getting a bit of an echo.
Yeah, that's what I was getting.
Yeah.
That's why I put the headphones on.
To the lay public, it gets picked up on Twitter, major newspapers will cover it. I think what's not problematic about that outreach, it's all to the good, is that it only goes so far, and it tends to attract the person who is predisposed to understanding why science is important. The thing that's missing is building that constituency for science, and science pedagogy, and it's hinted at in the film, more than hinted at in the film, science pedagogy for the most part has been terrible. And a lot of people go through a formative experience in high school, or even before that, they get exposed to science, it's boring most of the time, and they go on the rest of life, and it's going to predispose them to not really being more open to even some of the most interesting science that might come through their daily newspaper. That's where I think the science establishment still hasn't been caught up in proper understanding. They think it's just about the messaging as opposed to doing the legwork, which is much harder to prepare the recipient for receiving those kinds of messages.
Thanks, Dr. Orzack and Dr. Olson. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I am looking at this room, and I'm assuming we have a lot of future, some present scientists in the room. And I'm wondering what specific advice you can give, each of you from your vantage points, to scientists to avoid being condescending. Because that, to me, is one of the biggest ways that scientists shoot themselves in the foot, communicating with non-scientists. So, and I think people are often unaware of being condescending. So what do you do when you're talking to someone and a whole part of your brain is going, this is an idiot? How do you talk to them?
Boy, that's a stupid question. Just joking.
Every joke, there is part that is a joke and the rest is a truth.
Let's see. No, that's actually, that's an awesome question. That's at the core of the entire movie, which is, they all came off as condescending. Exactly. It's very, very challenging. I do have a deeper and more sophisticated answer to that than I had 10 years ago, which is, it's this narrative training that we do now. It's everything that I'm wrapped up in. It's the book that I published 2 years ago at the University of Chicago Press. It's the Story Circles narrative training program that we do. But more importantly than anything else, it is this universal narrative template that I have developed over the last 5 years, and but therefore. And that embodies the 3 forces of narrative, which is agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And in this training, you begin to develop the intuition, and that's what this is about. This is all about intuition, is that you've got to work on intuition. There's no instant set of rules that can change you. Unfortunately, at the moment, we have a National Academy of Science that is anti-intuition and putting out these ridiculously misguided reports and symposia on really kind of saying that there's a danger with intuition. But that's the only solution, exactly what you say, is developing the intuition to understand how communication works. And the way that communication works is through these 3 forces of agreement, contradiction, and consequence, which means that before you begin with contradiction, are we doing okay with the audio quality?
Yeah, I'm just trying to change the volume.
Okay. So what that means is before you begin with contradiction, or even talking about yourself, all communication needs to begin with the agreement, words of agreement, the and part. That's what exposition is. There's a great book from Jerry Graff at the University of Illinois Chicago, sold almost 2 million copies, called They Say, I Say, that's used in comparative literature and English classes across the country. Unfortunately, the sciences world has not begun to bring that sort of knowledge into training of scientists. But that template of They Say, I Say is the same idea of agreement, then contradiction. And unfortunately, when you're in a heavily literal-minded profession like science, you get trained that the information is the be-all and end-all, and not with the intuition to begin by opening these channels of communication through agreement. And that's really challenging sometimes when you're dealing with somebody whose views and ideas are completely opposite to yours, and yet that's the only way to get beyond the condescension thing. Does that make any sense?
No.
No? Good. Oh. Why doesn't it make sense?
Because you're basically asking for impossible. You're asking us to go against the grain of human nature. Like for me, that's a second nature to dismiss anybody who is not using reason and logic or logic. I can't deal. I can't. To be honest with you, I can't even perceive them as a human being. To me, they become an animal. They can't be reasonable. Reason and logic. Reason and logic. Everybody else is equivalent to a turtle to me. That's how I divide the world. I can't see them as a human being. If I'm going to try to reason with them logically and they're going to say, I feel, and you know, I mean, we all do, I'm sure I do too, but if you just say, well, who cares what you feel? This is a fact. It doesn't matter how you feel about 2 + 2. It's always going to be 4. It doesn't matter if it makes you feel good or bad. It's a fact.
If you meet a stranger, how do you manage to find, at what point do you find out that they are inhuman, as you say?
The minute that they deny logic and reason, or reason. Once they put their feelings above logic or reason, that's where humanity ends for me.
Wow. And yet, do you think that there's no such thing as the arts?
Absolutely. Most of my close relatives are artists. But I can logically reason with them. They don't go off on a tangent of, but it makes me feel bad, so you have to, you know, I don't know, disregard the truth. Okay, 2 and 2 is 4, it makes you feel bad. So now I'm not allowed to say 2 and 2 is 4?
What about if different feelings lead to different reason and logical conclusions?
But I don't think feelings is what leads to reason. It's facts. Facts and logic and
If it was a fact to Louis Agassiz that blacks were inferior.
Based on what?
Based on what he measured, observed black people in 1850 do.
But there was no measurement. If he showed me statistically, then I would say
Oh.
yes. And to be honest with you, I do feel, to put it politically correct, so we don't go there, that white people are less capable or less kinesthetic intelligence is much lower, and therefore they'll never play sports as well as a black do. And that blacks are inferior somewhere else. I mean, we all have our strengths and weaknesses.
But back in 1850, there were plenty of measurements. In fact, Steve Gould has written about a lot of these things, or wrote about a lot of these studies, which demonstrated to a logical person and with reason that blacks were inherently inferior. And in fact, if we had administered intelligence tests back then, maybe there were intelligence tests, blacks would have performed really crappily because they were so poorly educated. All I'm saying is that that informed the logic and reason of 150 years ago, and it was clearly, we can see in the rearview mirror from 150 years later, that it was very much tempered and mixed in with feelings and beliefs that pushed the outcome in a certain way. So my only point is that I'd like you to think that there maybe isn't such a hard divide between logic and reason and whatever leads us to believe a certain thing.
There's no question that it's much more politically correct to believe that there is no hard divide. But I guess I perceive world more mathematically. 2 and 2 is always 4. Doesn't matter which way you look at it, doesn't matter which way you're going at it, it's always going to be 4. And there's no other. But you're right, I'm old enough to remember where we believed in cold fusion for about 150 seconds of time.
All right, I think we're going to get stuck down this route. Okay, we can probably like talk about this later. All right, any other questions? So
Can I answer the question?
Okay, sure. Yeah.
About the question was about how to deal with someone who was, or how to overcome one's arrogance. Was that?
That's another way to put it, yeah.
I think, and it actually dovetails a little bit with what just transpired in our discussion here. just a bit of empathy. It is complementary to what Randy talked about in terms of understanding in a more formal sense how dialogue and communication actually works in people's heads. But I think the wellspring of that, or at least the centerpiece of that, is also empathy. And the starting place for me as a scientist in terms of empathy, when I talk to people, I say to myself, you know, I loved science as a kid. It wasn't the only thing I was interested in. But at the same time, I became fascinated by science, loved fossils, all the kind of stuff that Randy got fascinated about out in Kansas. I was doing it someplace else. And I loved science, to become a scientist, despite my bad experiences in science education. But for a lot of people, they're not empowered by that kind of fascination or love for nature. And it's very natural, not because they're inherently inferior in any way, it's very natural for them to just sort of say, ho-hum, this is something I can take or leave. And if you want to communicate with those people, at least understand that it's not because of any inherent defect. Be empathic with them. There's no inherent defect in them that channel them into the less receptive category. So I think it's being more aware of one's own prejudices. That's not intended in any kind of judgmental way, but blinders that scientists have taken on through their training. And one is to think, everybody must find this as fascinating as I do. Well, that's not the case. And if you can be in the head of someone who doesn't find it so fascinating, but might be interested in some of it, that's a good start.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Orzack. Next question. Okay, if I may just follow up on that, would you say then maybe we should approach it as, you know, how would you approach the, say, the victim of a hoax or something like that, or, you know, like as in the empathy thing, you know, like. I wouldn't. I mean, with it, no insult, but that sounds a little bit too condescending to me. I don't think you intend that, but I think it's important to just accept the fact that people are going to, especially after they transition out of teenage years, if not well before that, they're going to have less time for things that aren't so pragmatically based and important in determining the welfare of themselves and of their family. And so scientists live and breathe science all the time, but if you're talking to people out in Kansas like Catherine Martin, she probably, if you stayed with her long enough, Randy might know better, might come around to understanding certain facts about evolution, but in her day-to-day life it doesn't make that much difference. And people have to, I think scientists need to realize that there's only so much bandwidth that people have, and you have to pick your own battles. That's fitting in with the information overload point that's made at the end of the movie, which is it's very hard to compete these days. Look what happened in the election with misinformation, alternative facts, and so forth. You really need a full-time brain to get through all of that, and most people in this world, and at least in the United States, aren't really, they can get into trouble if they start using their brain too much because their boss comes down or something like that. So,
let me toss in a few comments also on this. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can everyone hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so actually your mentioning of cold fusion is perfectly appropriate, and that's kind of a trivial example, but in every field of science, yes, there are things like 2 + 2 that are hard, cold facts, but when you start getting up to larger levels of organization, you get a great deal of noise involved in it, and you end up with enormous ideas that are completely wrong at times. And I'm in the thick of this right now. The most important work I did as a scientist 30 years ago, in 1987, I published in prominent journals, and it was work I did on starfish in Australia, the major plague species they have there. And in the 90s, my work was basically inconvenient to a lot of scientists there who couldn't qualify for funding because of what I published. So they solved that problem by, for 20 years, ignoring my work and stopped citing it, and got thrown into the trash can, basically, as they raised tens of millions of dollars to do their research in the north of Queensland, Australia. And in the last 2 years, a whole group now in Sydney has gone and repeated the work that I've done, and now next month they're coming out with a big paper that shows that everything I did was valid, and that for 20 years these guys have gotten away with all kinds of fundraising simply by ignoring the work that I did, and now that there's an even bigger data set to support it. So when you work in science, you see those sorts of things that go completely against the grain, and I wouldn't call them subhuman or anything for what they did. I mean, they just kind of worked in their own biases and ended up ignoring my work as part of the scientific process. But you begin to see how deeply flawed the entire world of science is. It's only run by a bunch of humans who quite often don't even understand their limitations. They think they're somehow programmed at times to think that they're better than all these flaws and frailties that you have as humans. And so I've seen entirely too many things like that, and I'm sure Steve has seen just the same sort of thing. You get these trends, you get bandwagons, you get everybody jumping on a direction for research, and then a study comes out that disproves it, and you look back 10 years later like, wow, how's everybody thinking that? Am I right about that, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Question.
Oh yeah, I'm just curious, to a question for both of you, or to whoever can answer this. Do you feel like there's something to be said for the fact that in recent years we seem to have become kind of stuck on the original concepts of Darwinian evolution, such that like a general focus on this idea of small random mutations building up to one big thing, when there's like more breakthroughs in recent times have shown that it's not exactly like that. I don't 100% know the details of this because I don't really study much of biology myself, but my biology major friends have like gone on about like kind of how the general idea of evolution most people have is still like very behind the current times in terms of what we actually know about evolution nowadays. So do you think that this hinders you know, the public education and belief in evolution? The fact that, you know, essentially these ideas that are still being taught are rather outdated, and that we have better understanding of evolution now, or what are your thoughts on that?
There's always going to be a sort of lag between what's coming out of laboratories around the world and what's being taught, even in a place like MIT. And I will have to say, I think in some ways, MIT is an example. I mean, it's a great university, but it's an example of some of the most problematic aspects of academic science. I mean, where Randy and I got our PhDs over at Harvard, you can actually study evolution in its full complexity. I mean, there's lots of BS you can hear there, lots of different claims. He and I and various other folks, as you could tell from that movie clip of the poker game, spent lots of time arguing with each other, beating each other over the head. But there's a full complement of evolutionists over there, many of whom were also in the movie. At MIT, because of some of the major divides in academic biology, evolution is certainly acknowledged as an important reality, but it's not taught here in any meaningful way. And just to give you a quick idea, if you were to leave here, and many do, and get a great undergraduate education in biology, you will be acquainted with about 7 organisms: Arabidopsis, Drosophila, E. coli, Bacillus subtilis, the mouse, Mus musculus. You won't really have much of an idea of the concept of evolution and what we do and don't know and how it's changing with new studies and new developments, because evolution only is in the background as something which says this organism is related to that organism. And so MIT is a little bit unrepresentative. But more generally, and Harvard is no paragon of any kind of virtue, for the most part, people who go to elite universities like this, it's not so much the issue. They'll go out and they'll be well educated. People come from MIT, they'll be very well educated. It's more people who don't go to those kinds of universities, perhaps, as worthy as anybody else, but they don't really get exposed to how beautiful and rich science is as a way of knowing. So I hope that answered a little bit of your question. Andy, you want to add some thoughts?
You know, I don't know that I have much to contribute on that. That's a really good point you say about 7 organisms. That's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about that 7 organisms thing? So in great institutions, people only study 7 organisms and don't get systematic idea of evolution. Where do they? How do they? How is anybody?
Anyplace else?
Like where? If it's not here, then where?
Oh, there's a whole host of universities that have ecology and evolution departments, for example. Hundreds. Not at MIT, not at the Rockefeller, not at Caltech. There's been a major divide in biology between departments in academic biology, between academic departments in biology. They're called biology departments that are much more focused on what are traditionally called reductionist approaches, molecular biology, all great stuff, don't get me wrong, as opposed to places like Harvard, which have been a bit broader, many other universities, University of Kansas. A lot of those scenes were set outside the museum at University of Kansas, which has a world-class fossil collection. When you're an undergraduate like Randy and you go into biology courses, one of the things you do is take a tour of the museum.
Harvard has a good fossil collection.
Right.
It's not a question of collections, it's a question.
Well, there's courses associated with it. You can take a course in mammalogy, in ornithology, invertebrate biology, the coral reefs that Randy worked on, entomology. You can't do that in most places. You certainly can't do it here. I mean, it's a great education, but it's very narrow in a certain way.
I will add something to that, which is this overall struggle and direction between reductionism versus holism. And there is this kind of ineluctable trend and direction towards reductionism. And you see it in all facets of our society. And where I'm involved with it now, is circling back to what I was saying there at the beginning, is the kind of vanishing of intuition when it comes to communication. And, you know, not to get off on a whole separate track, but one of the biggest things I'm involved with now is working with people from the Democratic Party and the disaster that took place last year. And there's a great article that came out on Friday on Politico about you're not going to win these election dynamics through metrics. And that's reductionism, basically. The belief that we could just reduce everybody down to a bunch of numbers and suddenly figure out how all these people work and figure out how to give them a message that's going to work. It ain't that simple yet. Maybe someday, 30 or 40 years in the future, but right now, there's still this holistic element of intuition that is essential and is being lost with time, with this obsession with metrics. And that parallels back to what you're talking about there, Steve, of programs that get so consumed with the reductionist approach. There's an essay that I cited in my book that I got told about after a talk that I gave once that was from 1963. It's called Chaos in the Brickyard. It's a great, simple little thing. It was published in Science, a little one-page kind of little fable about once upon a time there was a brickyard where all these people made bricks for buildings, and over time they got so consumed with making perfect bricks they forgot what the bricks were for, and after a while they just had all these piles of perfect bricks and nobody even remembered what buildings were. That happens with molecular biology. People get so down into such a tiny little crevice that they're working on, they lose track of the big picture and don't even know what the value of their work is anymore. That's narrative dynamics. That's what I'm caught up with nowadays. And the net result is you end up just, you know, reinventing the wheel, going in circles, floundering, not knowing what the overall narrative is of what you're doing. Steve, you got any comments on that?
I would just echo that a little bit and say that one of the reasons I think Trump won is because he is a very effective communicator. There's no question about that. But he grabbed people in the gut. And there was a little anecdote that I read, which has stayed with me prior to the election. Theo Epstein, you know, the great GM of the Red Sox and now with the Cubs, his dad's a professor around here. And there was a little story in the Boston Globe sports section just before the election. I only read it afterwards. He was headed out to Chicago to see his son's team win the World Series. And he said, you know what, I'm really worried. This is like November 3rd. I play poker with a lot of middle-class white Jewish guys. They're voting for Trump, some of them. And he said, you know what the problem is? And he was so right. He looks at the scene. What he encapsulated it as was Trump voters will stand out in the rainstorm, a hurricane, all day to hear him talk. And Hillary Clinton voters went home after a little raindrop. I was at a Trump rally, actually, in Utah in October, and it was really amazing to hear and feel the energy. I mean, it wasn't an energy that I particularly liked, but it was really phenomenal. And that's about the kind of grabbing for the intuition and the gut that I think we need to pay attention to. Not to that end, but to really understand how to open people up to a good message by grabbing at their heart.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyone else have questions?
Anybody else go to a Trump rally?
Yes, that's what I was going to comment on. I went to the very last Trump rally in New Hampshire the night before, and the energy was amazing. I couldn't believe how many young people. I keep standing in line and a freezing cold, turning around to people in their 20s and saying, I can't believe there's so many people in their 20s. I can't believe that there's so many people in their 20s. I can't believe it. And they, the 20-year-olds, said, we can't believe it either. We can't believe how many of us are here. We can't believe it. Some of us are actually, I know it's politically incorrect, but some of us are actually has investigated and believe it and believe that's a better way for the world and better way for the country. There is not only one better way. I think he saved our country. I wasn't there because I was blind and didn't believe in it.
All right, so what does that mean for the country now? In terms of specifically this issue, like science education and...
That's a good question. I brought along, it's a great question. I brought along copies of the latest report on what's happening in Texas, at least in a very pragmatic, smaller sense. If you want to catch up on that issue, which will have national ramifications because the Texas State School Board does set standards that ripple across the country. The next hearing on that, the final hearing on what's going to be in the standards is in April. But there's battle lines are being drawn now, and there's been a real effort to ramp up what's going on there by the folks who've been hanging around since Dover and saying we're just waiting for our moment, and they feel as though it's their moment now.
Okay, hey, that's really interesting, Steve. Can you name any names of who's running all that?
There's an article that just arrived in my inbox on Friday from a scientist, which gives you, I have copies of it, gives a sort of rundown of what's actually happening. The Discovery Institute plays a role very evidently. I mean, it's written down, and some of the people who were on the website from 10 years ago are still very much involved in what's going on. The quote secularists in Texas are going to fight this tooth and nail, so there's going to be a lot of fireworks at the final hearing in April.
Okay, let me say one thing about the Discovery Institute, and flashing back to my experiences with the movie, and also Trump, because in my feeling after doing the movie and all the investigating I did, 90% of what went down back then in 2005 and 2006 was the work of a single individual. I felt Bruce Chapman, who was the head of the Discovery Institute. And he was the guy who was very savvy with the media. He'd been in the Reagan administration, and he was a Harvard grad, and he had a ton of connections and things like that. He was the guy who got the Cardinal Schonberg, whatever his name was, to write the editorial in support of intelligent design. He was the guy who had the connections that got intelligent design on the cover of Time magazine, which I view as the pinnacle of the entire movement. That was in August of 2005, and then it all went downhill after December when they ended up in the court trial. Had they not botched things in Dover, and that was a botched effort. It was 3 board members who just got a dumb idea in their head, and the Discovery Institute people were furious about that. But the key point was that there was one guy, Bruce Chapman, who masterminded most of the major accomplishments that they pulled off. And when they finally hit their Waterloo with Dover, he quit everything to do with intelligent design. He pulled up stakes and announced that they weren't doing anything more hardly for the Discovery Institute. There were 4 or 5 other knuckleheads there that were all involved with it, and suddenly they had no momentum because none of them had the confidence that he had. So if I have any one warning to everybody in our society, it's what I tried to do for the last year and a half with Trump. This and but therefore template that I've developed, I also turned into a metric that can show you some rough indication of narrative content that people are communicating. And the numbers for Trump were just sky high. And I began seeing this a year and a half ago. I set to work trying to get 5 different editorials published in all the major newspapers and all the major blogs and the 538 and all these other blogs, none of whom had any understanding of narrative. As a result, I didn't get any traction at all. The morning after the election, a whole bunch of emails came in from different people saying, you called this thing right for a year and a half. I did a podcast on, it's called The Business of Story. It's a hugely popular podcast in the corporate world. It's become their most popular podcast out of, I think, 80 that they've done so far, in which I ran through all of this. You know, these are the dynamics of Trump. This is the depth of narrative intuition he has. This is the intuitive level. He understands how mass communication works in our society. And that's what Bruce Chapman had as well. And we ended up in May of 2006, after the movie had premiered at Tribeca, I went to Seattle, did a screening, and then they asked me to come over there to the Discovery Institute, and I sat in a conference room, showed them. They wouldn't let me show the whole movie. They insisted I fast forward through it. And then 5 of them sat and shouted profanities at me, these supposedly Christian, saintly beings behind the Discovery Institute. And Chapman was at the head of the group, frantically taking notes, saying he was going to sue me and that this thing was horrible. And he was the one guy. And so single individuals that have got a deep understanding of narrative are to be feared if they're on the wrong side of the tracks. And that's my one big warning to everybody.
I would add a couple of quick things. Bruce Chapman is still the head of the Discovery Institute, and they are definitely ramping up their efforts. It's not to contradict Randy, I'm sure he did pull back, but they're ready and waiting, and they're not the only ones. Randy's probably aware of this as well, but our hero in the movie, the other hero besides Randy, Michael Behe, is the star of a new, wonderful documentary called Revolutionary, which had a big, it was premiered in the fall. You can see the promos of the trailers for it on YouTube. Just Google or put in the search box, Michael Behe Revolutionary. It's very slick. Nothing could be as slick or as sexy as Dodos, of course, but it's very slick, and it's coming out now. So they think this is their moment to really continue to push their agenda. I don't know who bankrolled that film. It could well be the Discovery Institute. So the game is afoot.
Wait a second, Steve. Is this the same movie that came out 3 or 4 years ago?
No,
it was about Texas.
It came out in October.
Interesting.
Yeah. Just Google Michael Behe Revolutionary. I just looked at the clip this afternoon, the promo.
Oh, wow, interesting. You know, I did a screening about 3 or 4 years ago at I think it was Temple University, and they had him on the post-screening panel with me, and that guy was the biggest doormat I've ever met, and he had just taken years of beatings for all the stupid things he said and done, and he sat there that night as everybody just, you know, insulted him in the Q&A, and he just kind of took it, and he's just done that for years. He's not real sharp with what he's done. I felt kind of sorry for him after a while, but interesting.
This new movie is very slick.
Okay. Yeah, I think maybe the movie I'm thinking of is maybe called The Revisionist. Is that it?
No, it's called Revolutionary. Michael Behe.
Yeah, I think we can actually play that during the wind down.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if you can see it at your end, but it's on YouTube. There's a 2 or 3 minute trailer, and there's a 1 minute trailer.
Yeah. No, but there was a documentary that was at Tribeca 3 or 4 years ago. I helped the guy a little bit. I think it might have been called The Revisionaries. I'm looking for it right now.
Yeah.
But that was, you know, another kind of pro-evolution documentary about what's going on in Texas. But you're telling me now that they're making a documentary for the other side.
It's all done in the book, and it's all in the can.
I think we'll probably be winding this down. So, Dr. Olson, would you like to plug any upcoming work or something like that?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, it's The Revisionaries, 2012. That's the documentary. That was a really nice one that was similar to Flock of Dodos, and it was about what went on in Texas. I'm up to my neck in narrative structure and working with James Carville. If you go to my blog, 2 weeks ago I spoke at his political science class at Tulane University, and he and I are working with a lot of people in the Democratic Party to try and get them to understand. What we had happen last year was a person ran for the presidency with no message, no narrative, no agenda, no clear agenda other than I'm going to do a whole bunch of good things. And you can't do that. the guy that ran against her had a clear narrative slogan, "Make America Great Again." And yes, it is that simple. The way that we communicate to the masses, you have to boil it down to simple things like that, and you got to stick to your message. And she didn't do any of that. And the whole Democratic Party is utterly naive right now about how these narrative dynamics work at the mass level. And talk about, condescension. That's exactly what that campaign suffered from. She failed to go out to those Rust Belt states and get down there and relate to the average people. And they're trying to figure out what's up with that. But anyhow, my blog is sciencemeetstory.com. And I don't know if you just search me, there's a bunch of junk all over the place. But that's the key thing that I'm in the thick of now. Is it's called Story Circles Narrative Training. We're doing it with a whole bunch of government agencies, and it's a whole new way to approach narrative. And it's very powerful, and it's gathering momentum. So that's what I'm often doing now, much more in the world of communications than in science.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Olson. Dr. Orzack, are you going to be making any more appearances in films?
Well, I do have a Kevin Bacon number, so I'm set for life.
Okay, you have one.
I would say that stay active, and as Randy noted, there's a bit of a controversy over the Scientist March, but I do think it's a great thing to participate in. And be active and listen to your own voice.
Thank you, Dr. Orzack. Thank you, Dr. Olson. Please, everyone.
Richard.